Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lunch Break Science. I'm Ariel Johnson from the Leakey Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting human evolution research and sharing discoveries in programs like this. We want to thank Anna Gordon Getty and Camilla and George Smith, whose generous support made this episode of Lunch Break Science possible. Here with us today is Leakey Foundation grant recipient and Leakey Foundation Science Executive Committee member, Dr. Daniel Lieberman. Dan, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Dan is joining us from Massachusetts, where he is the Edwin M. Lerner Professor of Biological Sciences in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. That's kind of
a mouthful. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that is. No, it's great. So today we'll be exploring his work focused on the intersection of human evolution and health. For those of you watching us live on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, you can leave questions and comments for Dan in the comments anytime during the episode, and we'll get to as many of them at the end of the episode as possible. The earlier you get those questions in, the more likely Dan will be able to answer them. I am especially excited today to have Dan here because I have had the privilege of working with him on several projects, and two of them are actually my all-time favorite projects I've ever gotten to work on at the Leakey Foundation. We have a couple of clips. The first was a talk he gave at called Born and Evolved to Run, where we explored how the body is evolved to run and how evolutionary insights can be used to prevent many kinds of injuries. It was amazing. We had a treadmill on stage. Dan and his colleague Ian Wallace conducted these live running assessments of a couple of audience members. That weekend, Dan led Team Leakey in running the San Francisco Marathon, and the staff all was on the sidelines cheering him on. It was a really, really fun event. The second was a symposium we actually held later that same year, and it launched our survivalism program. The symposium featured a group of scientists, including Dan, talking about how scientists, especially evolutionary scientists, can help us understand and confront the greatest challenging facing our species today. Dan was integral to the creation of this program. You can find both of these videos for the talks on the Leakey Foundation's YouTube channel, and we'll also share the links to them in the comments. I highly recommend you check those videos out. Dan, working with you, especially on the survival program, there is one phrase that is just kind of drilled into my head, and it also kind of runs throughout all of your research. And that is that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Could you explain what this means and how it applies to health and disease?
Sure. Well, first of all, I have to say one of my favorite memories of you, Ariel, and also is seeing you and Meredith at mile 15 in the San Francisco Marathon, just as we started going down the hill, so we had to go back up the hill. But anyway, so that phrase, nothing makes sense except in the light of biology, really, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, excuse me. It was a very famous essay written by the great biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky. And what he means really is that, we weren't designed, we weren't engineered, we evolved. And if you want to understand why the body is the way it is, you need to understand that evolutionary history. It explains why we're, it answers the ultimate questions of why. So lots of biologists work on the mechanisms, the proximate mechanisms, how, for example, the immune system functions, right? How T cells do their job and B cells do their job, and how antibodies work, etc. Those are the mechanisms that tell you how your body, say, fights a disease like COVID-19. But if you want to know why our T cells function the way they do, and why our B cells function the way they do, and why physical activity or stress or diet affect the immune system, then we need to take an evolutionary perspective, and that can be especially important for prevention of health, prevention of disease. But it can also give us insights into better ways to treat disease, and hopefully we'll get into some of those ideas today very briefly in this presentation.
Absolutely. And, COVID is certainly in the forefront of everybody's minds. When we think of diseases from an evolutionary perspective, why do we see a global pandemic like COVID-19 happening now?
Well, I mean, I mean, I think the real answer to that is that this is by far the first big major epidemic or pandemic, and it's sort of part of it's part of our evolutionary history. So let's get into the slides, and maybe I can sort of answer that with that. And oh, and before I go, there's a completely shameless self promotion, but I have a new book coming out on September 8th. Called Exercised: Why Something We Never Evolved to Do is Healthy and Rewarding, and it's a trade book, a popular book. I hope it will be a popular book. And on the launch night, we're actually the Leakey Foundation is co-hosting a public talk on the book with the Harvard Science Center and the Harvard Bookstore. And I don't have the URL yet, but it'll be at 7 o'clock on the 8th. So if you want to know more, and there's a lot of what I'm talking about today, a lot of that is in the book. But
yeah,
anyway,
we'll talk about the book a little bit later too.
Sure.
Hear more
Well, let's go on to answer your question. So for the next slide, then, if you could. I'm not in charge of the slides here. So basically, there's been an endless evolutionary arms race between pathogens and organisms, and we are just one end of this long history. So the first pathogens started attacking single-celled organisms like bacteria, and they evolved various kinds of immune defenses. And then when invertebrates evolved, pathogens got more sophisticated, and invertebrates evolved more sophisticated immune responses. So your innate immune system, which we'll talk about in a second, basically evolved with invertebrates. And then with vertebrates, we get a more sophisticated immune system, what's called the adaptive immune system, which works in concert with the innate immune system. And again, that was in response to further evolution of various kinds of pathogens, bacteria and viruses and other kinds of protozoa, etc., that have been trying to take advantage of our biology, and we've been fighting back. And it's just a nonstop arms race. So if you go to the next slide, we can talk about a very simplified equation to sort of think about this. Again, I'm super simplified, okay? So, but if you want to think about the number of pathogens out there, like say the number of viruses out there that are trying to, they're out there to attack us, that number is really a function of the transmission rate, how the pathogen gets transmitted from one individual to another, times the number of individuals, or the rate at which the pathogens encounter potential hosts, right? So that's affected by social crowding and population size and density. And then you have to remove from that all the individuals who either succumb to the disease, who die, they're removed, right? They can no longer be attacked by pathogens, or the ones who recover, like, as we know, Boris Johnson recovered from the disease. And so that's often a function of how well our immune system handles the disease. And both parts of this equation, the sort of the transmission encounter rate part and the mortality rate, recovery rate part, were made far worse by farming and industrialization. So if you go to the next slide, in terms of the left side of the equation, right, if you think about population size, the number of available hosts, the top slide shows the population of the world during the Paleolithic and then during the early farming period. And you can see the population of the world numbered in millions. And even when farming evolved, it's still numbered in the millions. And then with the Industrial Revolution starting around 1800, we started going up into the billions, right? And so now, since 1800, the population of the world has increased by about eightfold. So there are nearly 8 billion people on the planet today. So there are a lot more hosts out there for pathogens to attack. But even more importantly, or just as importantly, is that we're much more densely packed. So hunter-gatherers live in small groups in very, very large territories. So the density of hunter-gatherers is about 10 square kilometers per person, and your typical hunter-gatherer might meet just a few hundred other hunter-gatherers in her or his life. Once you start doing dry farming, like subsistence farming, you can pack a lot more people into smaller habitats, so that density decreased by about an order of magnitude, to about 1 person per square kilometer. And then with irrigation farming and industrial farming, that shrank even more. So we now are packed in really huge populations. And if you go to the next slide, and the other thing is that the settlements that we live in are now permanent, right? Hunter-gatherers typically move around 7 times a year, and they're in very mobile camps with not that many folks, and so there's just not a lot of sanitation problems, and they don't have domesticated animals that are sitting around them. But once we start living in villages, and then later even in cities, we're talking about thousands and then millions of people packed together with poor sanitation often. After all, sewers were only invented in the Industrial Revolution, and various other sort of sanitary technologies that we take for granted are all extremely recent. And then we're also living with cheek by jowl with all kinds of farm animals, pigs and chickens and goats and whatever. And those animals jump across species boundaries. So a lot of diseases that we're very poorly adapted to are the ones that we never encountered before, and those are viruses and bacteria, etc., that jump from other animals. And if you go to the next slide, of course, we all now know that COVID is no exception, right? It's a disease that jumped from bats, and bats turn out to be very interesting hosts of viruses because of their body temperature. And then, of course, we live in very high population world and a high density world with air travel and all that. And so end result is that this disease spread rapidly around the world at sort of breakneck speed. But it's only the latest in a long series of pandemics. I mean, we had the Spanish flu, we've had, Justinian's plague, we've had the Black Plague. There are many, many plagues that have spread around the world. And essentially, we've been living on borrowed time. And it's quite remarkable, actually, that we went so long, actually, without a pandemic like COVID-19. So I guess I'll just continue. So the question I really wanted to then ask that follows up on that is, can an evolutionary perspective offer us some clues about how to deal with this pandemic? So let's go on. If you go to the next slide. So let's go back to that very simple equation, right? The number of pathogens, which is really a function of the transmission rate and the encounter rate minus the mortality rate and the recovery rate. And one of the things that we're already doing make sense in terms of that equation, right? So we can decrease the transmission rate and the encounter rate through things like, wearing masks. There's no question we should all be wearing masks, right? Masks not only prevent you from giving the disease to other people, but also help prevent you from getting the diseases from others. Hand washing, of course, turns out to be important, but probably not as important as we initially thought it was. There's no question that social distancing is absolutely critical. Contact tracing is also important. Those all decrease the transmission and encounter rate. And then, of course, what we've been mostly focusing on in terms of the mortality and recovery rate are basically therapeutics, and we're all, of course, hoping that a vaccine will come along that will give us immunity. But there's something else that we can do if you go to the next slide, and that is we can affect the mortality rate and the recovery rate by boosting our immune systems. And there's been a lot of attention paid to comorbidities. So we know that obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, chronic respiratory disease, cancer, things that compromise the immune system or affect the immune system by causing inflammation, have really increased people's risk of getting substantially sick from the disease. But we can also boost our immune systems by decreasing stress, because stress is the enemy of the immune system. Stress depresses immune function, and as well as by increasing exercise. And you can see a picture of the wonderful Dr. Fauci, who's, I believe, 79 years old and apparently runs every single day. And so, given my interests, I thought we could talk a little bit about exercise. So if you go to the next slide, that'll highlight exercise, and then we can go on. So to understand this, it's important to get a little bit of background on the immune system. And this is a really complicated branch of biology, and I'm going to really simplify, and I apologize for that. But basically, there are two major sort of arms of the immune system that work together. We often divide them as one versus the other, but they're really kind of integrated in a complex way. So don't oversimplify this in your brain. But the innate immune system, which is the older part of the immune system, is the fast, local, cheap immune system. It starts with the barriers to pathogens in your body, the mucous membranes, your skin, earwax, things like that prevent pathogens from getting into your body. But once pathogens do get into your body, it's the white blood cells, right? The leukocytes that then attack them. These are killer cells, right? The macrophages, neutrophils, natural killer cells. These are some of the many kinds of white blood cells. So this is like the first line of defense. So when you get an inflammatory response, you cut your hand, etc. It gets red and swollen, etc. That's inflammation. That's your innate immune system working. But the other kind of part of the immune system is what we call the acquired immune system. It's slow, it's global, it's expensive, and instead of being non-specific, it's very specific. It learns particular and foreign things and chills just those things. And there's two branches of that. There's the cellular portion of the acquired system. Those are the famous T cells and B cells, and they function sort of together. And then there's the humoral portion. Those are the antibodies that are produced by B cells, which then glom onto things like viruses and then kill them. So next slide. So one of the things that we all know about getting sick is that it makes us tired, it makes us fatigued. The immune system costs energy, and especially the adaptive immune system. It's much more expensive than the innate immune system because you have to mount this big clonal expansion. When a B cell, you figure out a B cell works or a T cell works, you have to then multiply those cells gazillion times, right? And that takes a huge amount of energy, especially to do it really rapidly. So the immune system costs energy, especially the acquired immune system. And so if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, you want to spend as much energy as you need to on your immune system. You don't want to die from anything, but you don't want to spend energy needlessly. So there's probably been selection, this is really a hypothesis, to activate the immune system, especially the acquired immune system, primarily when you need it. So if you're sitting in camp, surrounded by your friends who you've known all your life, you're not going to really need to turn on your acquired immune system, probably, because you're not likely to encounter that many pathogens. But when you go out foraging, go out hunting, go out gathering things, or going out, that's when you need to be a little bit more aware, right? That's when you want to invest a little bit more. And I think that's one of the reasons why physical activity activates the immune system. And we have a lot of evidence to show you how that works. So let's go to the next slide. So to explain that, let's follow a pathogen invading the body. So that's because we're all worried about this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, which is caused by a particular virus called the SARS coronavirus number 2. Let's talk about how that gets into the body. So let's imagine, if you go back to imagine some jerk, coughs on you without wearing a mask, right? And you're within, enough feet that the virus will travel through air in droplets and hit your respiratory system. And next slide. And so you breathe it in, or perhaps it gets into your mucous membranes in your mouth or your eye. And this virus binds to a particular protein that produces an enzyme called ACE2, angiotensin 2, which is it's an enzyme it's a vasoconstrictor. So it converts a vasoconstrictor to a vasodilator. And many people take ACE2 inhibitors as part of that system, right? So that's where this virus inserts. It inserts onto this protein that produces these enzymes, and these enzymes are, if you think about it, right, because they're vasodilators, are present in your lungs, but they're also present in your bloodstream, and they're present all over your body where you want to alter blood pressure. So what the virus does is, if it manages to glom onto one of these receptors, it attaches to one of the receptors, it then will unload its RNA into the cell. Now, some viruses are DNA viruses, some viruses have RNA. This is particularly an RNA virus. The RNA is then injected into the cell, and then the cell basically gets hijacked by the virus, which then, and the virus, uses the ribosomes of the cell to make the proteins and then assemble those proteins and then release that virus, and then makes thousands and thousands of copies of that virus, which you then cough out and then unfortunately might infect somebody else. So next slide. So there's of course lots of, this is a really complicated big topic, but why might physical activity help boost your immune system? So let's go to the next slide. And there's several ways. The first way is that, as I mentioned earlier, we know that physical activity stimulates your body to produce key immune cells. And the two kinds of immune cells it most stimulates, and there are plenty it does, but the ones from which you have a lot of data are natural killer cells and cytotoxic C cells. So natural killer cells are kind of white blood cell. And what they do is you have a lot of them. They float around your body. And if they encounter a cell that's from your body, that cell in your body expresses a protein called the MHC protein, and it knows it's part of you and to leave it alone. But if it encounters a cell that has that MHC is bound to an antigen, it then knows this is an infected cell, and these, as the name implies, natural killer cells, the cells actually then kill that cell. It destroys the cell, explodes the cell. The other kind of cell, these are again part of the acquired immune system, are cytotoxic T cells, and they kind of do sort of the same thing. They have a different system by which they bind to antigens. They bind to a different complex, and if they bind to a cell that presents an antigen, they actually send these little kind of bomb-like molecules in called perforins, which then essentially cause the cell to explode and to lyse. The cell wall gets destroyed. And so cytotoxic T cells are also major barriers. So if you're physically active, you're going to upregulate those cells. Next slide. And so there's lots of data, and I just want to show you one experiment. So I'm not just making this up, but here's an experiment that was done a few years ago, kind of a clever experiment where they got a bunch of folks and they just, unfit people, 13 men in this particular case, and they had them pedal to exhaustion. So this is an acute stressor exercise. And then basically they measure the number of functioning cells, natural killer cells, and you can see after they went crazy doing this crazy exhausting, bicycle ride, they actually had fewer cells. And then they got half of them to train. So they had them do moderate exercise, 30 minutes a day for 2 months. And then some of them remained sedentary. And you can see, if you look at this graph here, that after 2 months, actually even after 1 month, the number of natural killer cells that were functioning, that were really useful cells, almost doubled, right? And then after they detrained, those numbers declined again back towards a level of control. So that's a typical experiment which shows you what the effects of physical activity are on natural killer cells. Could you go on? Next slide. So, and it turns out that physical activity also is incredibly important for upregulating antibody production. Again, this is actually extremely well studied. There are tons of studies on this. This study, I think, is important because I looked at older individuals. So this is a study from a few years ago where they looked at antibodies to a particular challenge, right? And these are controls in black. These are exercised older individuals in gray, and then in darker gray are younger individuals. And as you can see, that the exercise individuals, even after 4 weeks of exercise, had vastly increased by maybe about, I think it's almost like 8-fold their antibody production. Of course, they don't have as many antibodies as the young folks, but even after 3 months of that exercise, they still have substantially higher levels of antibodies, whereas the controls actually had a decline in antibody production. So if and when the vaccine is available, go for a run before you get the vaccine. You will have a much stronger response. And the older you are, if you're like me, the older you are, the more important that physical activity is to boost your antibody production. So physical activity essentially slows the senescence of the immune system. Next. And then finally, and maybe one of the most interesting functions is that, so initially when people measured some of these cells in people who were exercising, they thought, well, somebody would exercise and they'd see smaller numbers of natural killer cells or the other cells called neutrophils, etc. But then when they started looking in other animals, which they could actually take the animals apart after exercise, they found that there actually weren't fewer of those cells. It's just those cells had been redeployed. And this is called the surveillance or homing mechanism. So it turns out that when you're physically active, you redistribute your blood cells from the core, from, like, for example, from lymph nodes where they're kind of hiding out, into your respiratory tract, the mucous membranes of your respiratory tract, or your nose, or your gut. And so they're there ready to be in the vulnerable locations where pathogens are most likely to attack you. And so we know this from quite a few experiments. So that physical activity not only increases the number of cells, but actually puts them right where you need them to be. Next. So here's of course, the other line of evidence, of course, is epidemiological evidence. And there are dozens and dozens of studies, including among respiratory tract infections, and COVID-19 is essentially a respiratory tract infection. I'm just going to give you two examples, because there are too many to give you. But here's an example where they looked at a number of women. These are women who are actually trying to lose weight, so they had them walking every day. 45 minutes a day, 5 days a week. As you can see, for the first few months, it didn't really have much effect. So the people who are walking are in dark, and people who are just given stretching, so they have an intervention, but they're not doing as much physical activity, are in gray. But by 6 months, there started to be significant differences, and you can see that. This is a prospective study, so they're basically waiting for people to get sick, and sure enough, people did get sick during that. Cold went around, and by 6 months, the rate of respiratory tract infections was between 50 to 30% lower in the women who were walking 45 minutes a day than the ones who weren't. Another epidemiological study is the famous Harvard Nurses Health Study, which has studied over 100,000 individuals for long periods of time. This is from a subset of that analysis, but they found that, for example, the nurses who were more physically active had 30% lower incidence of pneumonia than those who were least active. And again, there are plenty of other studies. Next slide. So that does bring up a common question, though, which is that what if you exercise too much? And there's an idea that, for example, if you really exercise a huge amount, you're using a lot of energy, you're stressing your body, and so the result of that is that afterwards you're going to be in a kind of you're going to have an open window, a period where you've kind of depleted the energy reserves necessary to pay for the immune system, and that's thought to lead to this kind of U-shaped curve or J-shaped curve, where low levels of inactivity make you more vulnerable, moderate levels decrease your vulnerability, but very, very high levels increase your likelihood. And it turns out that this is not actually very well established in human beings. And when you look at the data, there were some early studies which claimed that they found this effects. Later studies have disputed this. So this is highly, highly debated. But the next slide I want to show you is an experiment that you can't do on humans, but which is done on mice. So this is a fascinating experiment. So they took a bunch of mice and gave these mice extremely lethal mouse flu, a mouse influenza, right? So you can see why you can't do this on humans. And just after they gave them the influenza, they had some of them, basically some of them just stayed sedentary. Those are the ones in red. Some of them they had gave moderate exercise. So they had them run 20 to 30 minutes a day. You could put mice on little mice treadmills. And then some poor mice were given prolonged exercise. They were subjected to 2.5 hours of running a day, which mice can do actually. And you can see that the ones who were given moderate exercise had an 82% survival rate, which is double the survival rate of the sedentary controls, who had only a 43% survival rate. But those poor little mice who were asked to run essentially little marathons every day, 2.5 hours, had only a 30% survival rate. So if that mouse data applies to humans, it suggests that there really is a kind of an open window, and that physical activity, sort of moderate levels of physical activity, are beneficial, but too much might indeed be a problem. Next slide. And then finally, I cannot mention this without talking about the related pathway, which is stress, right? So stress, psychosocial stress, other kinds of stress activates the HPA axis. You produce glucocorticoids like cortisol, and cortisol, which its job is to activate your fight and flight system, will suppress immune function. After all, you don't need a lot of immune function when you're running away from a lion, right? But the problem is that if you keep doing that for long periods of time, you end up suppressing your immune function for long periods of time. So people who are stressed have lower immune functions, and they're more susceptible, more vulnerable to respiratory tract infections. So of course, the way to lower stress is exercise, which lowers baseline stress. It's a temporary stressor, but actually ends up lowering stress, but also sleep and cognitive behavioral therapy and not reading the news and all those other sorts of things can also be important pathways. So the bottom line is that if we're going to try to fight this pandemic, exercise is important, decreasing stress is important, getting enough sleep is important. All of these things work together to help the immune system. Next. So I hope that one of these days, I've tried to do a lot very, very briefly, that we're going to look back on this epidemic and come up with a better strategy to deal with it. But in the meantime, moderate levels of physical activity and sleep and sensible diet and stress, all of these are good things. And I always say this, I think we should modify the Leakey Foundation logo and add a person who's exercising at the end. And I hope I haven't gone over, but happy to answer some questions now.
Yeah, so if you've got any questions for Dan, please be sure to put them in the comments. I'm actually going to ask you quickly, while we're waiting for some of those questions to come in, to talk a little bit more about your book.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, so it's called Exercise: Why Something We Have Never Evolved to Do is Healthy and Rewarding. So, as you mentioned before, we'll be having a virtual book launch event in partnership with the Harvard Bookstore and Harvard Science Center next month on the 8th. If any of you who are watching this video want to join, please subscribe to the Leakey Foundation's email newsletter, and we'll send you all of the details for that event. What will we be learning from this new book, Dan?
Well, the book is basically it's like a natural history of physical activity. So it's about how our bodies evolved to be inactive, but also active in the different kinds of activities we did and how that's related to health and disease. And the basic sort of, the book, each chapter actually tackles a different myth about exercise and or physical activity and inactivity. Like, for example, how bad is sitting actually? And do you really need 8 hours of sleep a night? And did our ancestors really evolve to be strong? And does running really bad for your knees and things like that? But the book is really an attempt to apply an evolutionary and anthropological lens to the problem of physical activity, because I think most people know that exercise is good for them, but they but they, most people don't do it, and most people don't like to do it, and we're told they're lazy. But actually, exercise. I mean, the beginning of the book starts with the simple realization that exercise, which is physical activity for the sake of health and fitness, is a completely modern, strange, abnormal thing. Right? We never evolved to exercise. We evolved to be physically active when it was necessary or fun, but we didn't evolve to go run on a treadmill or go to the gym and lift weights or that sort of thing. And it makes sense not to do it when you
Yeah.
don't need to do it. And so the book really tries to it's full of stories. It's very it's written as a natural history. It's very a lot of my experiences, but it ends with really how to apply this kind of evolutionary anthropological lens to the modern world. How do you get people to exercise? What's the right amount of exercise? What kind of exercise should one do? And how is that related to various kinds of diseases? But again, in a kind of a non, you know, I don't ever tell anybody what to do. It's rather trying to help people engage and understand and think about it and rethink about it, because I think we've over commercialized exercise. We've over
Right.
medicalized it. We sort of think about it, exercise is medicine, and sure, yeah, it is medicine in a way, but we didn't evolve it to be physically active for medicinal reasons, right? So I want to kind of dispel some of those myths.
Well, I hope for those of you viewing that you'll join us when he talks more about it, and we will now be taking some questions from the audience. Why would the fight flight response suppress the immune systems? Seems like the energetic cost of the immune system is really low in the moment.
That's a great question. I think it's because when you activate the fight and flight response, right, which is cortisol and epinephrine and whatever, you're basically you know that initial, if you think about the initial fight and flight, right, the kind of the initial shock of like a lion chasing you, right, you basically want to release cortisol. You want to get as much energy as possible available to you so you can run away from that lion, and so you turn off everything in your body that's not available, right? So cortisol just basically turns off your reproductive system, it turns off your immune system, it turns off your digestive system, it just turns everything off, that and just shunts energy towards your muscles so you can get away from that lion. That's the initial kind of acute stress, right? But the problem is that when you have a prolonged chronic stress, those excess glucocorticoids, those excess cortisol, ends up doing essentially the same thing. And we probably didn't evolve to have those kind of chronic stresses. Those are kind of modern, what we call mismatches, right? There were no lawyers or crazy presidents or 24/7 news cycles or whatever back in the Paleolithic, and sure, there were of course occasional stresses, and your body wants to respond to them, but those kinds of chronic stresses didn't exist. So they're kind of weird modern conditions for which we're really poorly adapted.
Very interesting. Okay, do you do differences between cardio and weight training
Oh,
exercise?
absolutely. Well, so it turns out yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked it, because most of the data I showed you were from aerobic kind of cardio training. Turns out that resistance exercise does have some benefits, but it doesn't have, at least in terms of the immune system, the same number and degree of benefits in terms of upregulating some of those cell types and redeploying them. So the evidence, so obviously, it's healthy to do a kind of a combination of both. Um, but aerobic cardio exercise has much more of effect on the functions that I was talking about. Yeah, thank you for asking that question.
Um, do you have extra time or to stick around and answer some more questions? We have
Of
quite a few
course,
questions.
absolutely, yeah, happy
And
to.
hopefully nobody on their lunch break will get in trouble with their bosses if they're watching a video a little longer. Are individuals who are heavy laborers more healthy than their age equivalent sedentary workers?
Oh, what a great question. It turns out that there's an article in the New York Times today that Gretchen Reynolds wrote about,
Ah,
showing that people who do heavy labor in their jobs seem to suffer some, at least, brain health issues. But there's
interesting.
no question that physical activity in the context of jobs is generally been healthy. That's how people got their physical activity for millions of years. You were a forager or you were a farmer. You went out in the field and hoed and dug, or you ran or you walked or you dug or you climbed trees or whatever whatever you did, and people got their exercise by doing work, and or when they were young by playing, or to some extent when they were older by playing. Um, but the big set of data that we have really mostly are the effects of physical inactivity and it turns out that although everybody's worried about sitting too much, if you look at the data on sedentariness, particularly sitting time and health outcomes, it's not so much how much you sit when you're at work, it's how much you sit during leisure time. So
Ah,
non-work sitting time is much more correlated with poor health outcomes than work time, sitting time. So those of you who have 9 to 5 jobs and you sit at a desk all day long, you don't have a standing desk. Don't worry, it's not the end, right? It's really leisure time physical activity, and that's what's really decreased a lot because people don't do exercise. In conjunction with the fact that many of us have jobs, more and more people today have jobs that don't require exercise during when we work, right? I mean, our jobs are to sit and stare into screens, especially during this pandemic. I don't know about you, but my step count is, apart from when I go out and exercise, my step count is just plummeted because
oh
I'm
yeah.
not walking to work and I'm not climbing the stairs and I'm not, doing the kinds of errands that I used to do, and that's a real problem. But I don't think there's a lot of data on sort of heavy labor versus light labor and the immune system. At least there is, I don't know it.
Do we have okay. Is there any research that shows physical activity helps COVID survivors to heal or repair the damage done to their bodies, especially lungs?
Oh, great question. So some of my colleagues are trying to collect those data now, but to my best of my knowledge, uh, you know, the I mean, I have one of my collaborators is a cardiologist who's been working with COVID patients here and at Mass General and others, and they're trying to collect some of these data now, but the data don't exist yet. At least not if they do, they haven't been published. I haven't seen it, but this is a question that's on everybody's mind at the moment. Yeah, because we know that comorbidities affect your vulnerability,
Right.
but we don't yet know to what extent fitness affects your survival or your ability to handle. We just don't have enough data on this particular disease, and this disease is, this virus keeps surprising us in all kinds of ways.
Oh,
And the fact that
absolutely.
it attacks the ACE2 enzyme, which is a fitness related enzyme, seems very intriguing, right? So it leads to that hypothesis, but to my knowledge, nobody has yet collected these data, but I'm very intensely interested and have been emailing people nonstop about it.
Well, when you find out, let us know. Maybe we'll
Oh yeah, well,
have an
believe me,
episode.
it's important.
Next question. Okay. What is the temperature of bats that
Oh,
allows them to harbor viruses?
so bats apparently have a high body temperature, just a naturally high body temperature. And so the viruses that have evolved in bats have evolved to be essentially, um, very resistant to those high body temperatures. And so that makes them even more dangerous when they jump into humans, because some of our normal immune responses, like increasing our body temperature to try to kill them, doesn't work as well. So the viruses that come from bats are traditionally um, the ones that scare uh, disease experts. They're dangerous.
How about our next question? We have a long one. Hi, Dan. Do we have any data on communicable disease rates versus level of physical activity? I feel I've seen smaller studies, but it seems that big data should exist looking at this correlation. And would it
Yeah,
help test that J-curve hypothesis, whether extreme exercisers get sick more or less often?
so that's a great question. So most of the data are just mortality data and there aren't, to my knowledge, nobody's really collected that kind of uh, large epidemiological data set on communicable diseases for extreme exercises, partly because there aren't that many extreme exercises out there. So the one exception are respiratory tract infection data, right? So there were some initial studies which looked at marathon runners and found that and reported, actually was done at the Los Angeles Marathon, and showed
Oh,
that people who ran the Los Angeles Marathon they reported higher rates of sore throats and things like that. So it was thought, okay, this is evidence for this open window hypothesis. But then some further studies retested those because those were self-reported data. And so some other marathons, they've actually looked at individuals who ran the marathon and people who like quit the marathon, et cetera, et cetera. And, because
Yeah.
you want similar kinds of people, and diagnosed whether there were respiratory tract infections. And those experiments found no difference between the groups. So that's led to a big debate about whether or not this open window really actually exists. And if it does, it might be different for different kinds of diseases. Because remember, as I said before, when you're exercising, when you're running, you may be more vulnerable in some ways, but you may be less vulnerable in other ways because you're moving all those killer cells and natural killer cells and cytotoxic C cells to your lungs to protect you from those kinds of RTIs. So those data are kind of controversial. But when if you look at just overall mortality data, and you look at curves of rates of death against exercise, and again the problem is that there are not that many people exercising extreme amounts. It's just a small sample size. The most people are sensible and don't run ultra marathons unlike Drew, and so or run run 100-mile bike rides all the time. So there's just so few people out there. There's just not enough evidence to be really sure about it. But for the studies that are out there are people who exercise 30 hours a week, right? We're talking a lot of serious exercise, and they're not significantly higher than people who exercise 15 or 10 hours a week. So there's actually no good data to prove that, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I think most people who think about exercise suspect that there is some cost of being over exercising or exercising a huge amount. It's just very hard to test. Sorry, it's a long answer, but it's an interesting question.
No, it is. We have another question. Where is the ACE2 held in the body?
So ACE2 is present all over the place. It's especially present in your lungs, in the lining of your lungs. But wherever there are blood vessels that have to dilate, there is ACE2. So they're in your vasculature, which is one of the reasons why people who get COVID can get vascular disease. They're in your gut. There are a lot of ACE2 receptors in your gut. There may be even ACE receptors that affect in the epithelium of your nose. Because remember, we know that people who get the disease, they sometimes lose olfaction, and there's an interesting pathway there people are beginning to study. So they're all over the body. I mean, not everywhere, but they're in many different parts of the body. Of course, we initially were focusing just on the lungs because that's where they're. There's an enormous number of them there, but they're really throughout the vascular system, the gut, and elsewhere.
I think we have one more question. If we were to look back and find a better strategy, what might it look like?
I mean, a strategy for dealing with this pandemic. Gosh. Well, I'm not an epidemiologist and I'm not an infectious disease expert. So this is a completely lay response, but clearly we should have, you need masks, you need social distancing, you need testing, and we failed on all of those, right? Early on, when things got bad, we didn't act fast enough. We didn't take the disease seriously enough. But also we didn't have the infrastructure. I mean, if you want evidence that we have failed to invest in a basic public health infrastructure that's necessary to turn on when something like this happens, the United States is evidence for that. We have for years, I'm going to get a little political now, but for years been told that big government is bad and that government can't handle these sorts of things, and the private industry should be out there, and that that our healthcare system is just fine, and this is proof positive that that's all just crap, right? That what we have not invested in public health in the United States. We have not invested in the health infrastructure. Sure, we have some wonderful hospitals and wonderful doctors and wonderful medical systems, but they're not charged with dealing with epidemics like this. That's not their job. Most doctors are paid to deal with people after they get sick, not to prevent disease in the first place. So we have failed miserably over decades of not investing in public health. And that's also true in terms of the percentage of Americans who have comorbidities that make them vulnerable. I mean, the percentage of Americans who have hypertension and obesity and metabolic syndrome, all of which make us much, much, much more susceptible to disease, is just dreadful. And that's, again, part of a public health issue. We've just ignored so many important issues. So helping people stay safe and stay healthy, and now it's come back to bite us, and it's terrible because the people who are suffering are not the people who've been making those decisions. Especially at risk are are people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. We know that Black people and Latinx people. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. We ran out of time, but
No,
maybe we'll have
big
to have you
topic,
back.
not enough time.
I know. But we'll have
My
you
pleasure.
on September 8th for your book event, and
Thank
that'll
you.
be really fun. You can visit us at leakeyfoundation.org to learn more about the Leakey Foundation, Dan Lieberman, and how you can help support research like Dan's and educational programs like Lunch Break Science. Right now, all donations will be doubled by 2 generous donors, meaning your impact will be doubled. Next Thursday, we meet Leakey Foundation scientist Ann Stone and learn about evolution and emerging pathogens. Be sure to subscribe to the Leakey Foundation's YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or sign up for our newsletter to be the first to hear about upcoming episodes and events, as well as groundbreaking discoveries in human evolution. Still hungry for science and can't wait till next week? Check out the Leakey Foundation's award-winning podcast, Origin Stories, available wherever you listen to podcasts. Lunch Break Science is made possible by the generous support of Ann and Gordon Getty and Camille and George Smith. Until next week, stay hungry for knowledge. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.